Hello everyone, welcome to my film review show. Today we're going to be talking about A Complete Unknown, and this was directed by James Mangold. Mangold is not someone whose work I'm super familiar with, though I know that he's directed quite a few different types of films, from westerns to fucking superhero movies to, yes, many biopics as well. He actually did a Johnny Cash biopic back in the day with Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon, of all people, and I've not seen it. But now he's tackling the early years of Bob Dylan's career, and it's interesting to note that, unlike a lot of biopics that we see nowadays, where they're trying to tell this grand story of someone's entire life and career, this film focuses very specifically on Dylan's early years, just before he went electric on Highway 61 Revisited. And typically, my problem with biopics as a genre is just that it does typically try to tell such a grand story of an entire person's career and life. And when you do that in a normal length feature film, 2 hours, 2.5, you don't really have time to sort of delve into the actual person. We don't really get to know the character because we're just kind of going through the big beats of their life usually. And so in a way, I kind of really like the approach that Mangold took here in focusing on a very specific time period of Dylan's life. It is a very refreshing approach, and I think it does allow us to sort of delve deeper into Dylan's relationships, as well as sort of his thought process for thinking about music and writing music and what the art is for. And I think another factor that helps this is the fact that it is so grounded in its realism. I feel like I've seen a lot of biopics in the last few years, especially musician biopics, that will try to go for this super highly stylized, kind of experimental in a way sort of visual approach, and that really falls flat for me in a lot of ways. I'm thinking of very recent biopics like Baz Luhrmann's Elvis or Bradley Cooper's Maestro. These films just try to go for a certain style, and with Baz Luhrmann in particular, this is a very kind of fantastical style that he's very known for. I mean, if you've seen The Great Gatsby, you've seen it, but it's very, very present in Elvis, and it just does not work, and it only serves to sort of distort the story that you're trying to tell. And with this film, I do, again, find it very refreshing to see that we're telling a very humble story and a very grounded sense of reality, and we're just letting the story, letting the characters speak for themselves. The particular period of Dylan's career that we're exploring is very interesting, and there's a lot to sort of dive into here, because it is telling the story of his early days when he was kind of coming up in the folk scene and he kind of exploded, and then he was kind of unsatisfied with his work. He wanted to go somewhere a little more experimental. He wanted to kind of subvert the medium of music that he was in, and that caused maybe some problems. And again, it's nothing that's super explosive or bombastic. It's just very focused, and it's very sort of, it just kind of asks a lot of questions about the tradition of art, the tradition of folk music, and sort of the tradition of innovation that music in the modern age especially kind of encourages. And I think Timothée Chalamet overall does a pretty good job as Bob Dylan. I do think that this is kind of a role he was born to play, in the sense that I don't know, he kind of has this laid back sort of carefree dude energy that is just so fit for a Bob Dylan portrayal. At the same time, Timothée Chalamet is always someone that I've struggled with, just because his celebrity status is something that I've never really felt like he could totally overcome and totally transcend. I think of a film like Dune, for example. I think you literally could have put any actor in that role. Why put Timothée Chalamet? He sticks out like a sore thumb, I think. And I don't know, I just feel like he's always had a sort of stiffness to him that I could never really quite get over. And that, I will say, is still present here to an extent. I don't think he really commits to his role as much as he could. But again, I do think it's kind of surprising how well he sort of like molds into this character just naturally. So I guess I do have to commend him for his efforts. But again, I like, it's because he can mold so easily into a Bob Dylan that I feel like he could have gone a little further. He could have, I don't know. There's something missing for me with Chalamet as always, but I do think this is one of his better performances. And, I think he does a good job with sort of like this sort of quiet emotional turmoil that, Dylan never really like outwardly expresses. It's all very like within him, there's a sort of torture within him that he wants to kind of free himself from. And he kind of does in a way at the end of the film, but it's just the beginning. It's just the beginning. And I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff happening here. And it seems to me that the relationships that are most focused on, that get the most fleshing out in this film, are between Dylan and the women in his life, particularly his two sort of love interests, that being obviously Sylvie Rousseau and Joan Baez. Now, obviously, with Joan Baez, there's a lot of complicated feelings here. They're both musicians operating in a similar scene, but they couldn't be more different in terms of their approach to the music. There's a great scene near the beginning of the film where Joan Baez and Bob Dylan have just spent the night together, and in the morning, Dylan is playing a new song he wrote, and the song that he's playing is Blowin' in the Wind from the Freewheelin'. And, he begins singing this song, and Joan Baez is sort of captivated by it, and she begins to sing along with him. And I think it's really interesting hearing these two people singing this song at the same time, because their style and their approach is so different, and they clash so much, and it's so subtle, but they do clash a lot if you really listen. Bob Dylan has this sort of like, he's like a rugged folk singer who learned everything by ear, and kind of really falls into that like tradition of like, folk music as an oral tradition. Whereas Joan Baez, talks about how she's had like very traditional lessons, and, her sound, I mean, you could put Joan Baez into an ensemble singing like an Ockeghem requiem or something. She's got that sort of like kind of crystal clear, perfect sort of Renaissance singer voice that, just clashes really interestingly with Dylan while they're singing Blowin' in the Wind. And it'll highlight a difference for them in terms of how they approach the music. Joan Baez seems to be very traditionalist in this film and sort of wanting to keep up the tradition of folk music, while Dylan wants to kind of push it further and maybe redefine what folk music can be. And I just thought that was very fascinating, and I thought that was a great scene. And it's very interesting how these differences kind of cause them to deteriorate their relationship a little bit. But I do kind of wish that we explored his fallout with Sylvie Rousseau a little more carefully, because I think there's even more to be gained from that on just like a personal level. We get sort of vignettes of them falling out of love, but nothing really is super deeply explored. And so I feel like the payoff at the end, where she finally leaves and forgets all about him and is able to move beyond him, it doesn't feel quite as impactful as I think it should. I do also wish we could have explored the relationship more between him and Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger was another folk musician who was definitely trying to uphold the tradition of folk music, or what he saw as the tradition of folk music, rather. And, is also kind of something of a father figure to Bob Dylan in this time of his life. And so I do wish we could have explored that more, I think. Ultimately, I think that there's a lot to admire about this, and I did enjoy myself watching it, and I would go see it again, honestly. But I think this does ultimately, I don't know, maybe it's just a problem with biopics in general. I do think this falls into the same traps that a lot of biopics do, of just kind of summarizing a period of someone's life, in this case. Admittedly, just because of its structure, it's able to do that a little less, but it's still there, There's still ways in which we could have delved a lot deeper, and I don't think it wanted to do that. There's definitely a lot to dig into here, There's a lot of personal turmoil and a lot of sort of political turbulence in this time period, and I feel like it just played it very safe. And again, it's a good film, and I think that it's well made and well shot, and it's very humble, and it's a good story. But I think it's just a little flat, just because, I mean, again, this feels like it's a very Hollywood sort of safe biopic, and I think that it just kind of suffers because of that. But, I think I'm going to leave it there. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.